Lonesome Lands podcast, Lonesome Report, April, May 6th. Cinco de Mayo was yesterday. You're probably still recovering
No,
from your margaritas.
I
Shad
thought we weren't
Sullivan.
allowed to have margaritas.
Why not?
Well, that's what all the progressives said, that anybody who voted for Trump cannot celebrate Cinco de Mayo.
No, I didn't even know.
Yeah, that was
Shows how
the
much I listen to them.
social media mantra this week.
Um, all right, lots to talk about this week. I guess to sum it up, since we talked about the mods every week and that was a big deal for us. That deal ain't over by a long shot. It was good to celebrate. They're not going to prison, but that deal ain't over. And as I put together, if you haven't seen on social media, I kind of clipped up. It was about 3 weeks before that press conference. You and me kind of suggested Brooke Rollins have a press conference, and I couldn't help myself, so I kind of clipped it together. Where they I'm not saying they took our suggestions. I said, great minds think
Maybe.
alike,
There you go.
or something like that. Maybe somebody was listening. Who knows? But and so, but as I did that, when you clip that kind of stuff up, you have to listen to it over and over and over. And one of the things Brooke Rollins was pretty clear when she talked about the charges that were getting dismissed, and it wasn't the civil charges.
Right.
And so there is still a case there that's getting worked out, and we'll be on top of that. But the good thing is they can now talk. They got their guns back. All of their really the rights that were being infringed on are kind of coming back to them. And like she said, they're back to where they were when the whole thing started. Like
hmm
there is
I
still
think they're starting over.
still kind of a disagreement where that fence should be, but they're not going to get hauled for prison over it.
But Jim, according to my source, the civil charges are going to be dropped.
Okay. Well,
We'll wait and see.
according to Shad Sullivan, don't worry about it.
Well, I'm not the guy. I'm just
But
the
they
third
haven't
party.
been. So that's just what I'm saying
Yeah,
is it's not over. Um,
correct.
and if it's your first time listening to us, you're probably completely lost on that, unless you listened to the USDA press conference last week. But what we're going to talk about this week is more about JBS because last week we went into a big old rant, I guess it was our history. It was our
Yes.
lonesome history. We're going to talk about Nature Conservancy and some other stuff going on. But I really wanted to get in this JBS deal because my whole thing was, um, I got my ideal, like they had this common ground summit. And as I look through that and I'm like, okay, the 40 biggest, most influential cattle people in the industry. And my question that keeps coming back to me is how did we get here? Everybody might say that we're in a great spot since we're all getting record prices, but the cattle herd is the smallest it's ever been. We have the least amount of, it's ever been in 50 or 70 years or whatever the
hmm
date is. But we have the least amount of cattle producers we've ever had since like
Yep.
the industry has really been created. And that number doesn't show any signs of, the opportunities aren't there for the future for people who want to do this in the future, and that's kind of where I think we should be going. So how do we get here under a place where there aren't opportunities in the cattle industry? And I thought a good lonesome history lesson would be kind of just showing the corruption that has been allowed in the beef industry, which the people who sell our cattle retail are the people we have to do business with, and who has been allowed to control that in the U.S. And I thought the perfect example of that would be JBS, which is a criminal organization that has been allowed and has seen very little pushback by the influential people in the cattle industry. Um, and why that is or how that's come about, I'm not one to point fingers or whatever, but there was people in that common ground room that I've seen testify in the Senate talking about how everything's great in the cattle business, and how we should have mandated EIDs and we shouldn't have mandates. Cattle, Don Scheffelbein, I guess I'll say, he was president of NCBA. NCBA's mantra for years has been, well, cattle people don't like regulations. We don't like we don't want any sort of regulations on the market until the EID thing comes along. And then now they're like, well, the cattle industry should be mandated to use certain ear tags in their cattle. And so, when you include people like him and other people in that room that are very pro EID, and have been very pro, I would say, concentrated industry, that made me
Yeah,
think of JBS and the kind of players that have been invited into this industry by the lobbyists. And NCBA is the lobbyists who worked for JBS. Whether they do or not, I guess is still up to question. They said they don't anymore, but
certainly it benefits JBS.
yeah, I mean to say NCBA doesn't work for JBS is a little nutty, but they say they don't. Um, And so I wanted to talk about JBS last week, and I did that in the history, kind of explained how they got where they got. And then when we were done, it came out, and I think it had came out earlier. It's just the other thing about JBS, they're a criminal organization that very little people talk about. And it hadn't come out that I had seen that they have been approved by Trump's SEC. Gary Gensler, the is it Secretary of Treasury, I believe, who controls
I
the
don't know.
SEC, to become a publicly traded company, and their IPO has been approved, and they're, I guess, just going through they're all ready to go. They'll probably have to set up a date to launch,
They
and
already did, May 23rd.
okay, there we go. This month, a couple weeks away, we're going to invite the most corrupt corporation in the country to become a publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange.
Gosh, dang.
And how did we get here? Right? We have an industry, a cattle industry, full of all these influential people who, from 2007 to today, have watched this company use bribe Brazilian politicians in order to become the biggest meat packer in the world. And all of these, our influential cattle industry has sat back and really done nothing.
We've heard zero about this proposal to be on the New York Stock Exchange from any ag media. Just there's one, Ag Daily. They reported on it. Nobody else seems to have reported on it. None of the ag trade organizations. Where are those people at?
Right. And I mean, it just goes to show, like, when I get told about influential cattle industry people, and I know the history going back to 2007 and JBS's first acquisition in the US. And we'll get into the really big questions concerning 2014, 2015, and how it all kind of ties into what we've been talking about these last couple of weeks. Because I guess, like it or not, we never really had this idea, but me and Shad, we just were like, well, we'll talk about news topics every week. And then it kind of turned into a whole thing where we just continue the conversation. Like, we bring something up like this JBS deal, and it's almost like, oh, all of a sudden we've got a lot more to talk about. Kind of like the
Yeah.
Maude thing, and there's been
Well,
a
it's
number
all
of subjects.
interwoven. I've
Yeah.
said it for years. It's all
Right.
interwoven into the same subject.
So if you're listening, make sure you listen every week.
Yes.
Um, but if you didn't listen last week, JBS is a Brazilian company. In 2007, they were a Brazilian meat packer started by Jose Batista Sabrino, I believe. And then he has two sons who have taken over the company, Wesley and
Jocelyn.
Josley. Um, and in 2007, they bought Swift Meatpacking in the U.S., and then they bought Smithfield Beef in the U.S., and then they bought Five Rivers Cattle Feeder, which was the largest U.S., still is, I believe, the largest U.S. cattle feeder, but they don't own them anymore. But they did all this within a year. And then in 2008, they attempted to buy National Beef, which at the time would have made them in charge of 35% or like they would have 35% of the U.S. beef market if they would have closed on national beef. But the Department of Justice and a number of states got involved and sued them for, concentration, I guess, when that deal was in the process. So they gave up on the idea. They bought Pilgrim's Pride in 2008. And I think when they bought Smithfield Beef, they became the biggest beef packer in the world. And then this Pilgrim's Pride just put them as, I think, the number two chicken processor in the world. And so what came out after all of this is that the way that they bought those companies is Brazil has a government controlled bank called BNDES, which is, I don't remember what the whole acronym is, but it's Brazilian Development Bank. And because it's government controlled, the politicians control it. This Josley and Wesley were bribing the politicians to get government loans, and this bank was also purchasing shares of JBS, just a constant influx of money to where they were just able to go out and buy whatever they wanted. And that's what they did. And so I'll get a little bit more into it, just so people understand kind of who we're dealing with. But what they were, so back to this book, this is where I've gotten most of my information. Raw Deal, Chloe Sorvino. I said last week I didn't recommend the book because there's two chapters that are mainly focused on JBS. There's a number of other interesting things. I haven't read the whole thing. I quit when I got into kind of, it just gets really into the climate hysteria, and I just but I'm going to read it the whole thing. I'm just, because going back and reading this, there's really good things in it, and I think I should just, I'll read the whole thing and report back
Expand
to
your
you.
knowledge. Just
Yeah.
expand your knowledge.
Listen to I don't know, whatever. But it was published in December 22, I believe. And so, there's been a number of things that happened since then, which we'll get into a little bit too. But um, the one thing it just describes in testimony the Batistas and J&F Investmentos, which is, it's the investment fund that the Batistas created that is actually the majority owner of JBS. So it all
Correct.
gets convoluted, but it's the same thing really as JBS. They admitted to bribing Brazilian politicians for a total of more than 150 million to illicitly acquire loans and financing from the Brazilian Development Bank BNDES and several Brazilian pension funds, in addition to more than 3 dozen other incidents of bribery. As far as the public was concerned, it was business as usual. At JBS, key customers like McDonald's barely flinched. All the while, JBS became a major force of consolidation in the meat industry. Um, and also key suppliers like the cattle industry barely flinched, barely reported on it. I mean, most people, when they hear this, they're almost like, did that really happen? Because why isn't this a bigger story? I mean, there should be movies about it and books written on it. And
Yeah.
when you really get into the corruption, um, and to go into like the U.S. investments, Josely Batista responded to an investigator during an interrogation with the Brazilian Attorney General in May of 2017, who asked if U.S. acquisition would have ever happened if it hadn't been for those kickback-hungry relationships, meaning the bribes. And he responded, oh no way, it wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have made the deal." Meaning, if they weren't criminals, they would not be operating in the United States. And that's who we are. I mean, we're going to give what the IPO means is, and some people have said, well, now that they'll be publicly traded, they'll be subject to more regulation, right? I mean, that's what I have heard. But it's like these people, and the other thing about becoming publicly traded, like they're traded on the Sao Paulo
Yeah.
Brazilian stock exchange, but becoming U.S. publicly traded means um, what you hear all the time by these other corrupt corporations. Well, they have a responsibility to the shareholders to become the most profitable company they can possibly become. And what's come out in the last few months, I'll hold this up. Maybe I'll put it on the video. This is Brazilian exports to the U.S. This gray line here is the 3-year average. The blue line with the dots in it is a full year. It's last year's full year, which, as you can see, it goes up quite a bit over the last 3-year average. The short blue line is the exports to the U.S. in the 3 months of this year. They have
Wow.
exploded.
They
Um,
have exploded.
and so when you look at a beef industry that is, now we're experiencing record prices, but the the responsibility to their shareholders is to become the most profitable business you can create. And that's what those imports from JBS are. And that's what's going to continue. The more hamstrung US, the more the US herd reduces and shrinks, the more profitable JBS will be. I don't
Oh
think
yeah.
that's arguable.
Yeah.
And so this is an America last acquisition.
Absolutely.
I mean, this has nothing to do with America First. And one thing I think that was brought up that's important too, we've talked about Pilgrim's Pride which JBS owns, was the biggest contributor to Trump's inauguration. That's what's been
Correct.
reported. But Brett Kenzie told me too. We've talked about Thomas Massey and how he kind of explained how people get on the ag committee.
Yeah.
Trump's inauguration isn't run by Donald Trump. It's run
No.
by the RNC.
RNC.
And who puts people on the ag committee? And who probably has a lot of sway over a lot of the cabinet positions? RNC. Like they paid $5 million to the Republican National Committee. Um, and so now and they're known for bribing politicians. And the other thing, to go back to Massey's deal, if you hadn't been listening, we talked about how he explained that Congress people, the way that they get on committees is lobbyists give them a large donation. They use that large donation and they give their campaign. So if just use Thomas Massey, if he wanted on the ag committee and NCBA or the Meat Institute or one of those big lobbyists give him a big fat donation, and it's kind of agreed upon that donation will go to the RNC and that will secure him a place on the
Yeah.
ag committee. Um,
Pay to play.
right. I mean, and to me, it's like, oh, you look at all this bribery that went on in Brazil.
Yeah.
Here, it's just legal. I mean,
I
that's what
mean,
it is.
the
It's like
Batista, yeah, the Batista brothers pled guilty to these bribery schemes of over, they bribed almost 2,000 legislators in,
1,800.
yeah, in Brazil alone, faced $256 million in fines
That's
on
just from
that
the
deal.
U.S. It was 3.2 billion from Brazil.
Yeah. Oh, it
But
was?
yeah, 256 million was from the U.S.
And then the 107 million Pilgrims Pride
Yeah. Well,
fine.
that's nothing. I mean, that's just one.
But
They have they
what
have price fixing settlements in chicken, pork, beef, like what Shad was talking about, 107 million is a price fixing settlement,
right.
which they're currently going through in beef right now too. And another thing that's brought up, the reason that they go through these settlements, none of these things go to trial because part of the settlements are you can't talk about
Yeah.
them. So it's like these guys want to be publicly traded. They fix prices.
Yep.
They collude with the other packers,
Yep.
and then they settle because that case can never be brought public. None of the details can be looked into. Part of that settlement is that like they can't look into any more of it. It's gone forever as far as
Yep.
JBS's involvement,
That's
and
right.
that's why they're the one. Cargill and Tyson, and they don't settle. I mean, Tyson settled a lot too, and in the other companies, but in the beef deal, they're dealing with a number of different lawsuits. JBS is the one who settled, I think, in every one of them. Well, except for the McDonald's one, which just came out. But JBS settles and then makes sure that nobody can talk about it, because that would hinder their ability to get an IPO.
Well, I think
Um,
their track record speaks for itself. I mean, remember when they sent all the rotten meat abroad? That
yeah,
was in I think 2017. Uh, it's just they've lied about their position in the climate change narrative, uh, talking, selling climate friendly beef. They've lied about their position in the Amazon forest. And it's just over and over and over and over and over.
Yeah. So if you go
So,
back to that quote, I mean, it's just lie after lie to, well, I don't know if they're under oath, but you go back to that quote I just said about how he said there's no way we could have made those acquisitions without the kickbacks. Um, when they were trying to buy National Beef in 2008, a Senator Cole, who started Cole's department store, I believe, or he's part of that family. He was one of the main guys pushing back on that purchase of National Beef, and so when he questioned the connection with BNDES, Cole asked Mr. Batista, "Is it true that the Brazilian government has subsidized your acquisitions of National and Smithfield or Swift?" "No, Senator. To my knowledge, that is not the case," Batista replied. "JBS today is a public company. We have had investments from BNDES, a federal development bank in Brazil. BNDES, a federal public company, has normal investments in JBS stock and has also extended JBS modest loans at competitive rates. JBS is a public company, and BNDES has some participation, but there was a public officer, and there are a lot of JBS shares traded on Sao Paulo Stock Exchange in Brazil. I believe that a lot of US investors have JBS shares." I mean, it just goes to show I mean, and later on it was proved that he just lied right to a senator.
yeah.
Um, and so well, you talk about the other, yeah, that's when your sole duty is um, shareholder profits. You talked about what was called Operation Car Wash, or Operation Car Wash was what was called when they were investigated on the bribery. There's the other operation was called Weak Flesh, I think. Importing Brazilian beef has been called into question as the safety of Brazilian beef has spent years reeling from major scandals. In March 2017, Operation Weak Flesh exposed Brazil's Ministry of Agriculture's negligence in exporting bad meat to the United States and other countries. Police raided JBS plants in Brazil along with several other plants and found widespread evidence of meat packers bribing inspectors and politicians to export unsanitary and rotting meat with traces of salmonella. Over the next 3 months, the agency inspected all imported meat from Brazil and at the end of June announced USDA was temporarily halting all imports. Um, Amid persistent calls to suspend tainted meat from Brazil for good, in June 2019, USDA veterinarians audited Brazilian slaughterhouses, including four owned by JBS, to determine whether it was safe to restart beef imports from Brazil. The audit found unsanitary conditions inside JBS plants in Brazil, from leaking pipes attracting flies to poor trash collection to more severe instances of failing to prevent brain tissue leakage among the carcasses.
Oof.
So, I mean, that's goes into that. But then, why isn't this talked about? One thing, we quoted Greg Gunthorpe. He's quoted in this book, and he talks about how a lot of people are afraid to say that JBS shouldn't be allowed to um, be in business in the U.S. So when they were being investigated, they actually recorded and they turned on some of their guys and they wore a wire, and then and they thought they were going to get off completely and not have to go to prison or anything, or get fined or any of that. But what came out, because they had worn this wire, they accidentally sent in the wrong recording to the investigators, and it showed them talking about how they were still giving bribes and they were bragging about how they were going to get off and all this. So the investigators actually heard that. So they had this plea deal in place, but when the investigators got that, they were like, "Oh, that's off." And so they ended up, both of those guys went to prison for 6 months each, I think, and then they got the $3.2 billion fine. If they hadn't have done that and it hadn't been found out that they were still doing these deals, they would have probably, gotten off with plea deals. Um, but one of the
Wow.
in the book it reads, another tape conversation from the time featured a politician allegedly discussing arrangements of who would pick up his payment of 625,000 reals, that's a Brazilian dollar, with Josley, and says without hint of irony, this is the politician, it has to be someone we'd kill before he makes a plea bargain. Josley can be heard agreeing, yes, yes.
Good grief. I'm
Welcome to
out.
the New York Stock Exchange,
I can't,
JBS.
I just can't believe it. I mean, so my question to you is who oversees the Securities and Exchange Commission, right? Because they're the ones that are going to be the authority of who allows him to become a part of that, aren't they?
Yeah. And the Exchange Commission has been a joke for my entire life. I didn't know anything about the stock market or SEC or anything
Yeah.
until I came home from a big art show in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the stock market crashed and I about went out of business because I was selling art, I guess, for and that just quit happening. And so then I started, if you've watched The Big Short, that gets into Goldman Sachs, the guy who ran, and Goldman Sachs continuously has the SEC chair. I'm not sure where Gary Gensler's from, but the guy who was put in charge of the SEC after the housing crisis in 2008 was Tim Geithner, and he
Yeah.
was the guy who had came from Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs at the time was shorting mortgage-backed securities, meaning they knew they were going to fail, while they were telling their customers to buy mortgage-backed securities. I mean, it was just they're just crooked outfit, and this has all been proven. Wall Street's just crooked. It's a shell game for sure, and SEC is supposed to oversee it. So, I mean, it's just one big casino. But um, what I think is really interesting is how when you look at the timeline and bring it back to cattle industry, from 2007 to 2017, all this stuff was happening and these people were bribing politicians. And if you look at the US cattle industry, we went 2014 was like record price year, right?
Right.
Everybody was making money. It's kind of like now. Market
Right.
was way up and all of a sudden the market crashed
Yep.
2015.
Yep.
This is at the time when those guys were running their criminal enterprise in Brazil
Yep.
and becoming the biggest meat packer, the most powerful meat packer in the world, and bribing politicians.
Yep.
And how that market crashed, what has come out, their most recent settlement was a lawsuit about beef packers working together um, to control the supply of cattle. And that's what caused the market to crash, according to these lawsuits. JBS is now paying, I think with this most recent payment, it'll be over 100 million. I don't know the exact. They've already paid one out that was like 50 or 60 million. And then this next settlement that's being talked about will put them well over 100 million to settle these lawsuits that all have the same witness listed. And he said, when the price gets high, we slow down production. And what that does is it reduces
It's
cattle
a
prices.
yeah, it's a controlled supply chain.
Yeah, increases
Absolutely.
supply,
Sure.
increases demand of beef,
They
reduces
also
demand of
lobbied to
cattle.
get rid of mandatory country of origin
Well,
labeling
yeah,
during the
that's
same period.
yeah, that goes to the same thing. So at the
Yep.
time where they were at their height of their criminal activity, it is alleged that all beef packers were colluding. I wonder who got that idea going. If that was the case, like they come into the U.S. and all of a sudden the four major beef packers all start colluding with each other, which would be illegal, and it gets passed through country of origin labeling gets repealed by the U.S. politicians at a time when they have been found guilty of bribing politicians in Brazil. But like I said, bribing politicians in the U.S. is practically legal. So it just raises a lot of questions in the cattle industry. How did that happen? And nobody's ever raised the question. We have a
Well,
criminal
some
enterprise.
people have.
Yeah, exactly. But we haven't said, like, okay, we have a criminal enterprise operating in the U.S. and all of a sudden these criminal activities in 2014, 15,
Yeah.
exact time, you know, it's
No.
obvious. It's
It
obvious. Put two and
it
two together
that's what I
of
was just
who
going to
was,
say. It's two plus two, and you know the thought that all of this runs downhill and there are a lot of people on the advantageous end of it is kind of the story of what we're seeing right now, right? I mean, especially with the repeal of MCOOL, um, and then of course the 40 elites will tell you that that market fall or was created through the drought, all of this stuff, all of this stuff, but we have these other things going on that you're talking about today. Very interesting stuff. And I don't think people understand how deep it goes because it's not just about their criminality, it's about their deception. And they were signed on to all these climate policies, climate safe beef. They've been accused of underhandedly helping destroy the Amazon rainforest. So the complaints against this company is not just from Jim Mundorf at Lonesome Lands. They come from huge, huge, huge environmental organizations, governmental organizations, agricultural organizations, and here we are going to let them, the most corrupt company on the planet, um, join the New York Stock Exchange. It's a kind of mind blowing to me.
Yeah, and to go in at about how they operate a little bit. So this was when they were going through this investigation before the plea bargain terms were disclosed to the public. Wesley sold shares of JBS at a high, meaning the investigation in Brazil hadn't went public. JBS
He
is
was going
being
short.
Yeah,
That's what he was
JBS is being
doing.
traded in the Brazilian stock
Yeah,
exchange. He sold his shares before it had been announced that he was under investigation
sure.
at a high and repurchased them at the future low, according to legal documents from Brazil's Attorney General's office. He made a profit in the financial markets of approximately 100 million Brazilian reals. Just on shorting himself. He's like, well, we're going to get investigated. Our stock's going to drop. So he sold. He knew it'd be lower. So then he bought it back when it was low. And I mean, that's who we've invited to do business in the United States cattle industry. It's just there. I mean, it's one thing after another. It never stops. But when going back to how in the U.S. Bribery is pretty much legal. What we talked about, like you make your donation to the campaign, you get your senators that are gonna do what you want. Um, Since arriving, this goes back to the book. Since arriving in America, JBS companies have earned nearly 900 million from federal contracts.
Wow.
That's including 9 million contracts signed on the day the Temer recording leaked in May 2017. So meaning
Wow.
that goes into the investigation. In 2017, they signed a $9 million contract in the U.S. while they were being investigated. More than 400 million in contracts through the USDA have been paid to JBS and Pilgrim's Pride for its meat in the last 5 years, over 150 million of which was purchased in 2019 alone. JBS gets millions more from other U.S. government agencies. This was just December 22 when this was published. So, I mean, I'm sure it's way more now. I'm sure it's over $100 million or actually $1 billion. They're 900 million at that time.
And I
Um,
find it interesting in that in a letter from the Senate, several senators to the Securities and Exchange Commission, in this letter, it states that additionally, JBS has a long history of misleading investors in its corporate filings by exaggerating environmental stewardship and downplaying other risks. JBS faces a pending SEC whistleblower complaint for making inaccurate claims when selling approximately 3 billion with a B of sustainably linked bonds to US investors. The whistleblower complaint cites evidence that JBS violated multiple anti fraud provisions of the federal securities laws, including several sections of the Securities and Exchange Act. You know, the crazy thing here is that was January 2011, just a little bit over a year ago. So it hasn't slowed down, and they've proved that their corruption is continuing and continues the whole time. And I guess we've just emboldened them. I
yeah.
So my question to you is,
Can you, before we go further, there, so that
okay,
that part you just read
yes,
was
sir.
part of a letter to
Hmm.
it
The
was
Securities and Exchange
January
Commission,
2024. So this was during Biden's term.
correct?
And so let me get here. So, and this was a group of senators. I'll read Cory Booker, Marco Rubio. So, Marco Rubio, our current Secretary of
Yeah,
State, he's asked for investigations into JBS since this whole thing started, going back to 2018. Um, but Sherrod Brown, Josh Hawley, John Tester, John Barrasso, Ron Wyden, Richard Blumenthal. These are all Chris Van Hollen, Peter Welch, John Fetterman, our favorite sweatshirt and shorts guy, Elizabeth Warren, Robert Menendez, Christopher S. Murphy, Bernard Sanders.
Bernie
Um,
Sanders.
so they're all senators. The one person in the Senate, I can't remember if she's a senator or she's in the House, that really pushed back in 2008 for on buying that national beef, and she's been really pushing back about against JBS from the get go. Is that Delario? Her name is. She's the purple haired lady.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's like maybe there is a reason why this isn't getting taken seriously. The only person wound up about it has purple hair in the Senate. But these guys were wound up about it. They urged the SEC not to allow JBS have a IPO. But one thing that was interesting in that letter that they wrote is they wrote the structure of the proposed offering attempts to ensure JBS would be exempt from U.S. laws. In its
Yeah.
prospectus, JBS says we are a foreign private issuer under U.S. security laws and as a result are subject to disclosure obligations that are different from applicable to U.S. domestic registrants listed on the New York Stock Exchange. As such, U.S. investors' legal option would be substantially limited in the event majority shareholders acted in a manner that conflicted with or harmed their interests.
It has that real. Remember when they were wanting to implement the natural asset companies on the New York Stock Exchange? It kind of has that same corrupt feel to it. I mean,
It's way
that
more.
they, well, it's way more, but this, what you just read in the rulemaking, they, they cited that as well too with the natural asset companies.
Oh, because it was a foreign deal and they
Mhm.
wouldn't be subject to U.S. laws.
Well, the investors in those, if they were a foreign investor, wouldn't be subject. Yes.
Yeah. And so I guess, I mean, that goes back to common ground. I feel like if the cattle industry should have common ground on any issue, it would be how about let's not allow foreign criminal um, enterprises into our, not only into our market, but to control our market. They control at the time of that book reporting, they had 1/5, 21% of all beef sold in the U.S. is JBS beef. Um, and then we're looking at a time now where we import more ag products than we export. I mean, everything points to this being a bad idea, and I don't know if anything can be done at this point. They're just going to
Well,
be.
that's what I was going to ask you. What can be done
I mean, that's a question. I
and
feel
by
like,
who?
yeah, I feel like we got one bulldog, and that's Harriet Hageman, and so I don't know. And she's spoken out against this deal
Yeah,
too,
she
I believe.
has. Yep.
Um, and so that would be a question for her. But I mean, the way it looks, as far as approved by the SEC, and I mean, yeah, we got 3 weeks, and you said that it
Yeah.
launches on the New York Stock Exchange.
May 23rd
They'll
is
be
when
ringing
their
the bell. They'll be
that's when
up
their
there,
board May
straight out of
23rd is when
Brazilian
their
prison
board
to
makes the
to
vote.
yeah, American success story, straight from Brazilian prison to ringing the
Gosh
bell on the New
dang.
York Stock Exchange. That's kind of welcome
It's
to U.S.
it's crazy.
agriculture. Um, but as far as the common ground deal, we got a farm bill coming up, and I feel like that's a big motivation for a lot of people, and a lot of people are worried. And as I'm thinking about this farm bill, and I was looking at Harriet's appropriations deal, and I would say another thing I think the U.S. we should all have common ground on. This will probably be a, I don't know what they say, unpopular opinion. I know it is because everybody says we need a farm bill. We need a farm bill. You know, Farm Bureau, NCBA. We need a farm bill. I would say we don't need a farm bill. Everybody knows it's. Everybody complains about how the farm bill is food stamps. You know, very little of the farm bill is a farm bill. So how about we don't have a farm bill? It's like Massey came out with this continuing resolution. Say this should be 12 different bills that we all can vote on.
That's what I think. It should be
Why
separated.
don't we? And the whole reason why mandatory country of origin got repealed. There's been a lot of talk this week about Sustains Act. All of these horrible legislation. The reason that they get included, that they get passed, is because they're involved in these
Because they're
omnibuses. The
included.
farm bill is an omnibus.
It's an
It's the
omnibus
way,
bill
yeah, it's the way for them to pass bad legislation.
in
And we
one
talk
fell
about
swoop.
Doge and all this stuff and trying to fix spending and all these things. Omnibus, these gigantic bills that contain gajillion dollars that nobody knows what it is because nobody reads it, nobody can see it,
Yeah.
but we're all just worried about increase our funding, you know, and then we vote for these people who say they're going to reduce spending. That goes into that common ground deal too. Do we want a government that reduces spending? Only if it doesn't reduce it on for our stuff. And so
Yeah.
that's where we're at. I think, and at some point somebody has to be, you know, one of these industries has to be a leader and say, you know what, reduce our funding, which isn't going to happen, but we, like, the cattle industry is supposed to be this independent outfit. um and I think, I guess I'm not going to speak for any organization, but I think there should be a push for no farm bill. Have the farm bill be about farming. You know, if the farm bill is going to happen, how about we make it to be everything that includes agriculture, and that's it. You know, food stamps not included. It's a USDA bill, is what it is.
That's what it is a
Yeah,
USDA bill.
which it
But
shouldn't be. Everything that funds the USDA shouldn't be happening in one bill that has to be voted on.
no, I agree with you. It
And I
should
think
be.
the vast majority of American people and the vast majority of people in agriculture also agree. Why can't we do it? Because of people like JBS that are in there
Yes,
telling them,
it
well, this is
is
how we
the
have to do it so we can get this shitty legislation through.
it's the global cartel, the global cabal, and it's the money that comes from the top down, like I've been talking this whole time. And they have the power of the lobby. They have the power of the lobbyists. They have all the power because until we get that money and that influence out of there, Jim, we're not gonna change this thing. And if you ended paid for lobbying today, you know what? That farm bill would be split up in 12 different merit-based bills.
Yeah.
And people would have to read the son of a buck,
At least 12.
you know?
But I mean, we just have this election where everybody's excited. Oh, we're going to cut spending. We're going to reduce corruption. We're going to do all this stuff. And then we've got NCBA and Farm Bureau. We need a farm bill and we need it now. And then we got JBS with their IPO and we got
I
all of
know.
this stuff going on.
I know.
But,
And I,
we got Doge saying they're going to cut all this stuff, but then they're still passing the continuance resolution. It's just incredibly frustrating, especially when you think you've got something happening. It's like if Biden or Kamala Harris was in there, we would have zero expectation. But
yeah, that
I mean,
that
and
does
that's the
change
thing about
perspective.
right. And that's the thing about Trump. I don't ever want to seem like a Trump apologist. His SEC chairman just approved this deal. This is Trump's SEC now. And so, don't say we never said anything bad about him because when something bad comes up, we're going to bring it up. But I'm still glad, the reason we supported Trump is because Kamala Harris would have been a complete and total disaster.
I
But it
watched.
goes into everything. Like you support your politician, get them in there, and then just close your eyes and let them do whatever they want.
Well,
That's
it's not
that's
that
the other problem with American politics.
Jim. It's not that you close your eyes and they do what they want. They do what they want anyway because they've become part of the swamp.
Yeah, but
And once you cross into the borderland of the swamp we call DC, you're bought and paid for, and you have to serve that king. It doesn't matter who it is. You have to serve it, and that's why we see so much corruption everywhere. And especially, and you and I talk about agriculture because that's where our perspective is foundationally based from. But it is until we end that all of that uh, flow of money for enticement for agenda driving. I don't know that there's a lot of change, and it's going to have to be the independent producers of American agriculture that formulate that change. I mean, this is a big deal with JBS getting on the New York Stock Exchange and nobody's talking about it. The most corrupt company. I mean, here's 2 pages of this letter, 2 pages of this letter, and the whole letter is engaged in about corruption.
Yeah, describing their, I mean, it's not
Every
corruption, it's
single
criminal activity.
every
They pled guilty.
single yeah, and
I
and,
mean,
they
it's
and they
not a,
brag about it. I mean, they brag about it. Every single paragraph is about how corrupt and how bad they are, and yet we're going to let them formulate and further monopolize our financial industry and the ag industry and the beef industry, the meat industry, whatever it may be. So where I mean, what good is the SEC oversight? It is no good. Anybody can do it. Anybody can get in.
right. And that's the thing. Like in 2017, I was just starting Lonesome Lands, and I'll admit, up until I started this deal, I didn't pay any attention to anything. I was a hired man. That's what I still am, is a hired man on my family's
Me
outfit.
too, bro.
And um this stuff didn't really affect me. And then I decided I wanted to write about agriculture and look at these issues. And so back in 2017, I never saw anything about this. I never saw anything about this until probably the Holcomb plant fire, and then I started looking into like the beef packer collusion. That lawsuit came out. I read the lawsuit, and then it comes out, what JBS's true history is, and it's just like, holy smokes. And that goes back to the question, how did we get here? We got here by listening to the most influential people in agriculture, right?
That's why
Like
that's
if,
why I always say, we're here because of your policies. We have to change policy.
right,
The reason there's less producers on the land is because of their policies, not our policies, not the independent producers' policies, but their policies that have had very much influence, whether however that influence came, but they've driven that policy in the direction they wanted it to go through influence. And it hasn't always been about, it's almost never been about grassroots producers. I can remember in 2014, of course, that the market went sky high. And then in 2015, that thing dropped faster than it ever had in history. And I was very, very much aggravated. And I can remember, studying all this stuff, and I've forgotten a lot of it, to be honest with you. But I was studying this stuff, and it was coming, and it was all starting to make a little bit of sense. The interwoven diabolical web is what I call it. And so I called the NCBA president at his home at the time, and I can't remember who it was.
you don't even remember his
And
name?
I can't
What
remember
year
who it
was it?
was. 2015.
Oh
And
yeah, I wouldn't
he
know.
told me, he said, what you're seeing is a normal function of capitalistic markets. And I'm like, what?
The
And by
exact
the
same
time,
thing they said after Holcomb
yep,
Beef Fire. Exact same thing
exactly.
they said all through COVID.
Exactly. And I'll never forget, before I got off that call, he had made me feel like I was the stupidest son of a buck that ever walked the face of the earth. And I was so downtrodden after that phone call. I was like, I'm done with them. I'm done with that. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I got to go off and do something else on my own to help change this because um, the functions were not there. They were not there.
What else you got?
Let's talk about how on April 17th, Congress launched an investigation into a Biden administration using CCP linked nonprofit to manage land near military bases. And why this is important to understand is because we just got done And we're not done yet, like you said, but we just got done uplifting and helping the Maude family out of South Dakota beat a federal case of overreach into them getting charged separately in with criminal charges for theft of government property. Now, this is all interwoven into this web that I talk about, created very much so created by the use of the Sustains Act. Maybe this in particular wasn't exact lineage of the Sustains Act, but it speaks to how it is all involved. And so, we talk about often, me and you talk about public private partnerships and the power they have over the bureaucracies. One of the original um, guilty members of forming public private partnerships in the United States was the Nature Conservancy. Now, the Nature Conservancy, is I've had direct dealings with them on our issue in Colorado back in 1999. And so they are really good about going out and creating these partnerships with government agencies to drive policy and agendas in agriculture and land issues. So they support and uplift a lot of conservation easements, conservation values. I call them conservation bribery schemes. They were very much behind Biden's Executive Order 14008, America the Beautiful, or 30 by 30, uh, where
They're
we were
all
going
in
to set
on solar panels and
all in.
windmills, and they want to
They
conserve
are.
nature, but they want it covered in solar panels and windmills
Well,
also.
what they want to conserve is the control of the land to themselves, right? To themselves and their partners in crime. Well, one thing that really come out this week that was very interesting is that okay, so let's take for example, we've been acknowledging the issue of Chinese government or Chinese population buying land in the United States over the last several years, right?
That was so America First Policy Institute. That's where Brooke Rollins came from, our current Secretary of Agriculture. The main, like when she became Secretary of Agriculture, I think a lot of people looked at America First. The main thing they talked about as far as agriculture was foreign ownership of, and mainly Chinese ownership of ag land.
Correct. It's been a very large issue for a while now, and the odd thing about it was is that a lot of this Chinese ownership of land was near these military installations all over the United States, right? And I can vouch for that. Um, in Colorado, there's a lot of military installations that they are creating buffer zones around. But anyway, the Chinese Communist Party has uh, been associated with a lot of that. So we come to find out that the Nature Conservancy partners up with the Department of Defense to create what they call these buffer zones and wildlife corridors around these military installations to conserve, the ecosystem there, whether it's the animal ecosystem or the plant, the all of that. And that's all fine and good. However, we also find out that the Nature Conservancy has been partnering with the Chinese Communist Party for quite a while now, and they have been receiving funding from federal taxpayers to the tune of, well, just under Data Republican over the last few years, $567 million. In the last 5 years, they've received 40 million from USDA alone for these conservation practices. Well, we come to find out that they have several offices in China. And the people that are overseeing those offices in China are direct heads of the Chinese congressional delegation um, in their background or history. So now the federal government has come out and said, okay, now this is weird. And even some environmental organizations are coming out and saying the Nature Conservancy is um, partnering with landowners around military bases to put buffer zones. The Chinese Communist Party is buying land near military bases. The Nature Conservancy has offices now in China, and they actually have a guy in the United States who's a member of the Chinese Communist Party that is here to spy on Chinese citizens living abroad here in the United States. And so the worry is that those Chinese officials working with and in tandem with the CCP and the Nature Conservancy are going to have undue influence over the Nature Conservancy and have access to their data, right? And which would be federal agency data through public-private partnerships, and then private data through these conservation easements that they put on private land. But it is kind of blossoming into kind of a big old deal, right? And it is a big deal because once you have these, I'm not saying the Nature Conservancy is directly partnering with the CCP. Is just linked to the CCP because of its affiliation and their offices. The Nature Conservancy has partnered with them in China on conservation practices through their federal government over there. So
And this
it
all
is,
comes, did you say this is a Washington Examiner article?
yeah, this article comes from the Washington Examiner. Here's another one that comes from Earth Fund, believe it or not, that they were a little bit worried about. But if you want to see how they've spent these taxpayer funds, you can go to Data Republican. But like this $48 million, almost $50 million that they've received from the USDA it's not just USDA, from government agencies over the last 5 years. It included USDA, Department of Interior, Department of Commerce, Department of State, Agency for International Development, which is USAID. And then they funnel that money into conservation practices through NRCS. And then that's how kind of they're worried about these members of the CCP gaining that data, right? So it's turning into something pretty big. And because it's because of their relationship with the Department of Defense in these buffer zones around military bases, it's getting to be a little bigger deal than I think they thought it would ever be.
Yeah, and
So,
they buy up tons of land too. They've just bought 25,000 acres in Custer County, the same county the mods
oh
are,
yeah.
and that's why we started talking about them. But yeah, you go into that, all that federal money getting thrown into them, and then they buy up a big ranch. And I've also been told that they transfer land back to the federal government.
Agencies.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
They absolutely
that's
do.
something I want to look into because I just heard that the other day. But it's like, and so it's just a shell game, right? Like the federal government gives them
Mm-hmm.
money, they
Mm-hmm.
buy a bunch of land, and then they donate the land back to the federal government.
Correct.
It's like the
So,
instead of instead of the Forest Service coming in, buying that ranch and turning it in the 777 Ranch in Custer County, right next to two national parks, right in between two national
mhm.
parks. Instead of the federal government doing that, which is what they wanted to do, I believe, in 2011, or something similar. So they give Nature Conservancy a ton of money. Nature Conservancy buys the land, and now who knows? They could transfer it back, and it becomes, um, you know, a national
Okay, so
park,
one
or it
example,
connects the national parks or
yeah, and they're
wildlife
talking about
corridor, which
wildlife
is what they want.
corridors. Absolutely, these aren't new concepts, but one example of this is between Colorado Springs and Pueblo, um, on the west side of I-25 is Fort Carson, a military base. And I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands of acres that military base is, but south of that military base and southeast is was a lot of open country that a family with the last name of Walker, Bob Walker and his son Gary Walker owned. And the Nature Conservancy back in about 2007 comes to them and they want to create these buffer zones and easements so there is no more encroachment from Colorado Springs and no more encroachment from Pueblo on that land. And because it's up against the uh, Department of Defense land, which is Fort Carson, the Nature Conservancy comes to him and says, "Hey, let's start putting easements on all of this land." And so that's what they did. in particular, this land, productively speaking, might be worth $300 an acre, $350 an acre today. The Nature Conservancy comes in on a specified 1,650 acres that they owned and paid them. I'm sorry, on a specified 1,350 acres, paid them $1,650 an acre to keep that out of production and to keep it open space. And so this is where your taxpayer dollars are going to. It's allowing the Nature Conservancy. Now they now have 80,000 acres in that under one fence there that is protected, 100% protected, and the Nature Conservancy facilitated all of those easements. So it's a big deal. And basically, what we're doing is we're paying an ENGO to influence the direction of productivity
Well,
in
it,
agriculture.
it just never ends. As
It
far
never
like
ends.
land prices, the amount of producers on the land. When land prices are driven up by the federal government pouring money in the organization, we have multiple organizations now buying land in big chunks that are hooked to the federal government. It just we all talk about, oh, we want more younger producers to get involved.
No,
Land
they don't.
prices are so out of whack with production that
Yeah.
that just, I mean, that's a big issue. Also,
Um,
goes Nature Conservancy has some. I remember I was in Nashville walking down Broadway there or whatever, and there was a gal, and I stopped and talked to her, and she was like had a sign up and fundraising funds for Nature Conservancy so they
oh
could
my.
plant trees somewhere. They said, and I was like, "You got to plant trees with this money? How?" And she's like, "Well, I don't know. I'm just working for the organization." I was like, "They're taking over ranches out west." So I don't know nothing about that. Which it was just stupid to even talk to her. It was obvious, but they're probably just looking for drunk kids who are there with mom and dad's credit card to make a donation, I guess. I
So
don't know.
there's this gentleman by the name of Ying Wu, who is the board chairman of the Nature Conservancy's China branch. And he is an active consultant for the CCP's Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. Um, The office conducts espionage and spies on Chinese people living abroad and is part of the United Front Work Department, an entity that works to influence people and organizations outside of China for the benefit of the CCP. And that was the whole worry from the federal government is, are they going to have that undue influence on the employees of the Nature Conservancy who have access to the Department of Defense, right? So I don't think this is anything small. I think we have to really, really watch this, and we have to remember not only did they receive, according to Data Republican, $567 million. Their membership or their donators since 2023, 2 years, in 2 years, $1.17 billion dollars. So this is a company
Which
that
and
is
who
worth.
knows? Like, are there donators the Chinese government?
We don't know. How do you know that?
And also, why did it ever say in the article why they have offices in China? Like, they're not controlling Chinese land.
Yeah, yes, they formed a partnership with the CCP to help the CCP implement conservation practices in China on Chinese land. That's why they have, I think, four offices spread across China, which is a huge nation, but it doesn't matter if they have one. Their headquarters is right here in Arlington, Virginia. That's where the Nature Conservancy headquarters are. They are an American 501(c)(3) or nonprofit, whatever they are.
That comes in handy when you're looking for money from DC to have
Sure
it.
does. Sure does. So that's kind of a big story there, bro.
What else you got?
Talk to me about some history.
Well, I thought we'd stick with bee packing. So I wanted, this is going to be, I want to talk about the history of agriculture and all that. I think, it's obviously we're always a little cattle heavy on here, but I think it's interesting to go in. I thought it'd be interesting to go in and look at. the company Swift, which is what JBS bought, which is what
Mhm.
the first company they purchased in the US. And you kind of compare how companies used to become successful and how they do now, back before there was all this government money getting shoveled out.
Sure.
And I mean, there was plenty of corruption back then. And I'm sure Swift was, I don't know. But anyway, Armour, Philip Danforth Armour built the first large scale meatpacking plant in Chicago with his brother Herman in 1867.
Wow.
So this is back, I went back to this book, which I probably shouldn't have talked bad about, but they shouldn't have excluded Charlie Russell from it. I don't know. I'll never, I need to get a hold of this guy, find out why he did that. I suppose he's a big Remington fan.
What book is it?
Cattle Kingdom. It
Yeah.
talks a lot about the Northern Ranges, and it talks
Yeah.
about Teddy Blue, all of Charlie Russell's friends. Guy was the most influential, what I say is the most influential Western lifestyle guy there is, artist for sure. And he was completely excluded. What the hell are you doing?
Sorry. I thought it was this book
The
right
Cattle
here.
King. No.
Yeah.
Who's that about?
It's about the cattle kings, bro.
Oh, the King Ranch?
No.
Or just all of them? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Back to this.
Sorry about that.
So then George Hammond and Gustavus Franklin Swift. But my wife, so here's a everybody thinks I'm mean. Shad told me that I say words wrong sometimes because of my teeth.
I did not say that.
Yeah, you did. You go, it's your teeth. I'll try it again. Gustavus Franklin Swift, who both had moved west to get closer to the source of the cattle, would make their names by tackling the problem of refrigeration. So Swift, so Hammond, they were shipping live cattle from Chicago east to get beef east. And the way they would do it, starting out the way they would do it, they'd unload the cattle to feed them and water them, and then they'd load them back on the train. Could you imagine these wild longhorns dumping them out of the train and then trying to get them back on the thing? I don't know. But eventually they got cars that were made for cattle because at first they were just using like box cars. And eventually they got cattle cars that you could feed and water inside those cars.
Right.
But there was still all kinds of, I mean, when you're dealing with horned cattle, and can you
Yeah.
imagine how many dead ones would show up? Or,
Or how many horns are sticking out the side?
yeah, and they're wild, so they're probably
Yeah.
going bananas in there. Um, but anyway, these guys, they thought we need to kill the cattle in Chicago, ship them east. And Hammond said the problem is you can't keep it cold. So at that time, the only refrigerated product getting shipped on the railroads was fruit, and they were using ice to refrigerate it. And so these Hammond was like, oh, "I'm going to use ice," and then they tried it and it worked. And then Swift said, he kind of took that idea and went with it. And Swift had arrived in Chicago with $30,000 capital from the sale of his share of a successful wholesale butcher business. But more important, he brought with him his Yankee thriftiness as well as a work ethic and general fastidiousness that would prove invaluable. That's how people used to make money, a work ethic and a general fastidiousness. Nowadays, it's a bunch of crooks, but
Yeah.
one of 12 children, he had begun slaughtering and selling beef since he dropped out of school in the eighth grade on Cape Cod. So
Wow.
yeah, Cape Cod. I figured they'd be in
Yeah.
selling fish up there, but he was selling beef. Lacking capital to build the refrigerated rail cars himself, he persuaded a manufacturer, the Michigan Car Company of Detroit, owned by the McMillan family, to take a 15% down payment on each car and risk the rest of the payment on the success of the enterprise. The gamble paid off for both parties. Within 2 years, Swift had over 100 refrigerated cars running between the Union stock yards and the rail terminals in the east. Um, and so they would pack these cars with ice, and then the obstacle arose. It said that the rail guys, the railroads were making enough money on these cattle. They don't want to deal with refrigerated cars, partly because they didn't have anything to haul back with them. Like you run cattle cars to East Coast with cattle in them, and then you can fill them with whatever and run them back. Um, but a refrigerated car invariably returned to Chicago empty. So
Hmm.
what this guy did is um, he found a railroad company that wasn't shipping any cattle, so that this was all a new business for them. They agreed, and um, he ended up getting it shipped east. His rail line would go up from Chicago up into Canada, hit the big cities up in there, and then come back down the East Coast. And so the reason he did that was because there was ice manufacturers on along the way. He could
Very few,
repack
I'm
his
sure.
repack with ice. But it said even when the path was cleared for dressed beef to arrive fresh and in a timely manner in Boston or New York City, new problems cropped up. At first, the wholesale butchers saw no reason to accept the beef that customers might perceive as somehow less than fresh. Swift retaliated. He proceeded to build his own warehouses and his own wholesale operations. He ran advertising campaigns extolling the meat's virtues. Where necessary, he and other meat packers offered their meat directly to the public at enormous discounts. The public bought it, ate it, and loved it. In city after city, the wholesalers were forced to surrender. In each market, the first to do so usually received an offer from Swift. He would buy out the business and makes it Swift's exclusive local distributor. There you go. That's how businesses used to be built in America, with like ingenuity, hard work. He got hit with problem after problem after problem. He just kept pushing forward, and he got through it. And one day, the company named after him would be sold to sold to a Brazilian outfit who had bribed the politicians in order to get the loan to buy it. All right, man. Another uplifting episode of Lonesome. Oh, go to lonesomelands.com. I've been selling t-shirts, subscriptions. Well, I have some potential advertisers coming up, but what really helps me in order, we talk about the reason people don't talk about these kinds of things. It's because they're controlled by industry. I am selling ads, but my goal with the subscription is to be able, anybody who buys advertising, they're not going to come in and tell us what we need to say or what we can't say, any of that kind of stuff. And the way that we can keep doing that is if you go to lonesomelands.com, click on subscribe, sign up. You can get charged monthly or yearly, and there's small amounts and bigger amounts, and buy a t-shirt or ball cap. Come
Subscribe
back
right
next
here,
week.
lonesomelands.com.
Adios.